Well, hello YouTube, it's me Fortmaster, and welcome to a new reaction. So yeah, a couple months back on one of my older Laserpig reactions, I am forgetting which one at the moment, somebody suggested that I should watch this video by Pilgrims Pass right here, called How Ukraine Manifests the Modern Epic. Granted, it's been several months since I last looked at that comment, and I didn't actually write down who suggested the video in the first place, so I'm very sorry that I don't remember you. But with all that aside, I swear, with everything that's been going on in Ukraine right now, I am just, granted, been hearing some good things recently as of the time of recording. Ukraine's been making some new gains, very surprising gains, and I mean surprising to the Russians. I don't actually know that much about the video. Apparently he's, in this video, he's used, like, footage that he's recorded himself in Ukraine. So, yeah, good for him for being on the front line. But yeah, with all that being said, original video will be linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will be leading to my newest Let's Play, and with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
In February through March, I was in Ukraine, working as a volunteer at a hospital. I was there for the anniversary of the invasion, doing my best to help out. For the month and a half that I was there, I had a glimpse, if a brief one, of a nation at war. I was far from the front, so nothing too exciting, except in some moments, like in the moment after I first arrived, where I had to be rushed from the hotel I was staying at because it was in a high-risk location and a possible target for missiles, since it was next to an energy grid, apparently. That was when I learned why the hotel was so unbelievably cheap.
Oh, okay,
Also, there was
course.
the periodic rush to the bomb shelter whenever alarm sirens went off, which got more and more frequent as time went on, from once every couple of days to twice a day at some point. But that just meant getting a break from work and waiting an hour underground until the alarm stopped and we could go out again. Yet there were these two nights where rockets apparently hit close to the apartment that I was sleeping in, and in both instances, I didn't hear them. Never thought it was that deep a sleeper, but thankfully there were no casualties at those particular strikes. But being there, what shocked me the most was the apparent contradiction of what I was experiencing. The land was cold and harsh and scarred. The light of the sun often hid behind gray clouds or glinted on great sheets of snow that covered everything. Yet the people were vibrant, warm, and gentle, and surprisingly in high spirits despite everything. Sometimes I could even forget that there was a war, because everyone put so much effort to make me feel welcome. I was just some foreigner, and there was a great historical tragedy happening in their country, yet still they took the time for gentle acts of kindness and to make sure my needs were met. It is precisely in such times where something as simple as kind hospitality becomes a heroic action, and it was such a privilege to witness this constant heroism up close.
I mean, I can't really add anything to that. The only thing that, comes to mind is, keep calm and carry on. The British did it in World War II while they were being bombed by the Germans. I mean, at that point, it's literally just psychological warfare on your part. It's the whole thing of, yes, they're attacking you, but if you don't show that it's bothering you, if you just keep going on, if you keep going about your day normally, the psychological damage from that, well, not damage, but the morale damage that was expected to happen, from the attacks will start being on the attacker instead. And simply put, I mean, a country will continue to keep fighting if its people want to keep fighting. And if they don't look like they're going to stop fighting anytime soon, then you can start having morale problems on the attacker's side, because then they're saying, hey, why are we even doing this? They're in this for the long haul, which evidently with the actual Ukraine war, it looks like it, unfortunately.
Like when I came across a wall full of military badges from combat veterans who had made it back from the front. They left their badges there as both a sign of respect and a testimony that they had survived, a solemn show of defiance against death, since these were objects they carried on their persons while in combat. It was a very touching thing to witness, and as I contemplated the different symbols and insignia, such as the Trident of Ukraine, the image of Saint Michael, and... wait a minute, is that the Star Wars symbol of the Jedi? And just like that, the idea for this video was born. Granted, That badge was worn as a joke. The Ukrainians are great for their sense of humor. But you know what they say, there's always a bit of truth in a joke. The truth being that the soldier who carried that symbol of the Jedi undoubtedly saw himself as fighting an evil empire that threatened his loved ones. Reminiscent to Luke Skywalker being compelled to fight after the Empire burned down his home.
Yeah.
A perspective one can completely understand, considering that's exactly what the Russians are doing. Which made
Yeah,
me
exactly.
ponder on the power of stories as modern mythological narratives, and thus the power of movies as vehicles for grand ideas that are essential for human meaning, especially in times of war and political upheaval. And what's hilarious is that I realized this and started writing the first draft of this video script while still working in the Ukrainian hospital. NATO itself tweeted this absolute gem of a post, saying something similar that I realized, but in the cringiest way possible, signaling that I wasn't alone in my observations,
Oh,
but
no.
the way they did it was really silly. Which spawned a flurry of memes and flabbergasted responses, and people making fun of them on the internet. But to be honest, what they said is kind of true, and typical throughout history. People act like NATO making allusions to a fictional story gives them the credibility of a hipster millennial drinking his overpriced double-decker soy vegan latte who goes all, "Whoa, this is just like Harry Potter, bro." And yeah, it can come across as not only very childish,
God.
but even in bad taste, since this is a real war with real lives being ruined, and people dying who are irreplaceable and a net loss to all of humanity. But people in power have always made appeals to legends and works of literature where they compare themselves or their soldiers to famous protagonists and their opponents to famous villains. It just so happened that in the past, when leaders said something was Homeric, Arthurian, or made allusions to the Divine Comedy and Shakespeare, everyone would think they were erudite and intellectual, while in our day and age, no one thinks you're awesome for watching Star Wars or reading Harry Potter. But that says more about our attitude towards our modern epics, more than anything. Some have pointed out the dangers of weaving fictional narratives into a real war, as it can be dehumanizing, like calling the Russians orcs. But there's a very clear and historical reason of why the Lord of the Rings as a mythological metaphor seems so applicable in this war. But I wish to make clear that although I 100% support the Ukrainians here, I don't hate the Russians as a people. Although I have many Ukrainian friends, I also have a Russian friend who is completely against this war, as many other Russians are. I am both Brazilian and Italian, and things were done in history which I'm not proud of.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the last couple minutes, I can say, like, I agree with all of that. I mean, hey, I don't like China, but I don't like the Chinese government is the thing. The Chinese people, I mean, you might even say that they have, I hate them even less than the Russian people, because at the very least with them, they don't have the chance to vote for their leaders. But then just going back to the whole, like, epic thing, the national epic and the Homeric stories, you know, all that sort of stuff. I can't remember from where I heard it, but I remember once hearing that superheroes and like comics and like superhero stories were almost basically like our modern equivalent to like stories of like the ancient Greek gods and Greek heroes and stuff like that. And it's kind of, I have a feeling I'm going to be adding more onto that example in the next, couple of minutes.
We've all been the invading orcs in one historical period or another. And despite history bringing Russia to this terrible action, I have faith that in the future, Russia will be reformed, and whatever demon that haunts them now, and that made them cause this ridiculous waste of life, will one day be exorcised from them, and they will live in peace with their neighbors. It's happened before. Just look at Italy now. Everybody like the pizza. Italy has so many friends that the Italian passport is one of the best to have. Hopefully the Russians can be reformed into a positive force, like we were, and know what that's like. All I can say is that in my time in Ukraine, I came to the conclusion that yes, despite NATO putting it in the least eloquent way possible, Ukraine is indeed undergoing one of the great epics of our time, and I believe I can prove it.
Tropes of the modern epic. The tyrant, of course. Though that being said, the last military parade they had, where they had literally a single T-34-85 drive through Red Square, that was just pathetic. Yeah. Thanos, yeah. Dune, yeah. Freedom Fighters, yeah. Well, I mean, isn't that sort of thing? I mean, like, a lot of these things are... I mean, it's a little hurtful to say, but they're rather generic, where you have like the Tyrant, the Rebels, and stuff like that. But I mean, that can be applied to almost anything. But still, I mean, this is awesome so far. The end of an era, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh yeah, Avatar. Love that show. World ending, yeah. Has anybody been keeping track of the amount of times Russia has threatened to nuke somebody since this war started? I actually want to look that up. Death Star, yeah. And the glove. Yeah, and the ring, of course.
When NATO appeals to stories to attempt to inspire action in the real world by implying that you too can resemble a fictional hero in your own life story, it sounds really cringe and maybe even manipulative in how they did it, but historically, this is actually an immensely powerful method of inspiring action, when done with more subtlety, like creating a flamboyant 6-foot-tall muscle man wearing the American flag and targeting teenagers to rile them up for a war that the USA
Captain America,
is still neutral
yeah,
to.
of course.
Stories are so powerful, in fact, that the two leaders of this conflict, Putin and Zelensky, are products of movies and television shows, which either shaped their lives or prepared their arrival on the political scene.
I didn't know Putin, because I know he was like he's a former KGB agent. I think with Zelensky, if I remember correctly with Zelensky, he was a comedy actor who, like, before being voted in as president, was, I think it was like a role involving, it was a comedy movie involving a comedy actor being voted in as president, which everybody was kind of like looking at that like, what? Well, then again, it's been a few years since I remember hearing that story, so take my word with a few grains of salt.
Often forget that Putin's life path was decided in his teen years, when he saw an espionage drama in theaters about a Soviet spy and his adventures against the Germans. Something about that cinematic
that's what they meant.
Completely captivated a young Putin's
So instead of Putin being in the movies, he saw him, okay.
Imagination. Immediately after that, he visited the KGB headquarters.
Yeah, give me a second here. Yeah, so I just noticed this when the popped up, but is it just me, or does a young Vladimir Putin look like a knockoff Macaulay Culkin? Or is it just the hair? Am I going crazy?
Immediately after that, he visited the KGB headquarters and asked to join as a 15-year-old. They told him to come back when he was older and to get a law degree, and he did,
Okay.
officially joining at 22 in 1975. He was even stationed in Germany, just like his cinematic hero, which is a fascinating fact of his life, in my opinion. Plenty of teens watch a cool movie that might inspire them, but how many truly dedicate their whole existence to try to be the protagonist of said movie? By the way, you can watch that very movie, The Sword and Shield, from 1968, here on YouTube for free. Though when I tried, the subtitles were out of sync. But it's still fascinating to watch and to get an insight into the driving narrative of how Vladimir Putin sees himself as he shapes the 21st century in his image. And we realize how the historical context shapes movies, who in turn shapes the minds of young people who then grow up to shape history. Which is why it makes sense that a World War II film is the inspiration of a man who might cause World War III. Interesting how these cycles play out. It indicates...
Again, I've heard it several times. History does not repeat itself, it rhymes.
It's something very interesting that I'll get into later. One thing to remember is that the Soviets financed those spy movies precisely to recruit and attract a specific type of personality for the KGB. And they did it by glorifying that archetype in the silver screen. They needed more educated types, willing to go the distance, and Putin fell right into their hands. But then they fell into Putin's hands, as decades of popular spy propaganda films fueled his rise to power. Because that's what happens when you make your citizens see the devilishly cunning spy archetype as a national hero, which reveals the nature of political programming. It's a two-way street. Other than the ability to shape the dreams, hopes, and character of individuals inspired by stories and narratives, political programming also has the ability to shape public perception on what makes a hero or a good leader. When Putin was 21 years old, more KGB propaganda was launched to the public in the form of the Soviet version of James Bond, the Otto von Sterlitz TV show, which portrayed a heroic spy eerily similar to Putin's character, which caused speculation on whether the latter was influenced further by this archetype of the disciplined master manipulator. Either way, at the time of Putin's rise to power, people were aware of his similarity to this popular character. In the year 1999, the Kommersant newspaper commissioned a poll asking which popular persona Russians wanted for a president, and Sterlitz came in second place, after Marshal Zhukov. Putin rose to power a year later. You see, political programming at a societal scale doesn't work if it's not popular, which means that the political programmers need to adapt to their citizens' demands in a way which means their citizens also program the programmers in a way. Political campaigning is similar to political programming, since it's also a concerted effort to influence people's political decisions, but it's much less aggressive, less top-down, and it's freedom-based, since it's only offering one out of several political options. Enter Vladimir Zelensky, who played the president of Ukraine on screen before literally becoming president himself, effectively using storytelling as a presidential campaign with his TV show, called Servant of the People. And it worked, even generating an entire political party of the same name. Though the Ukrainian political comedy influencing their politics is not that of a lying master manipulator spy in service to a dictatorship, but that of a well-intentioned common man propelled to power by popular support, due to his frank honesty. Now, Ukrainian politics might not live up to the ideal, because no politician lives up to the ideal of honesty. But it's a morally superior heroic narrative to at least try to live up to in comparison to Russia's glorification of the cryptic master manipulator. Even if a spy serves his country, the ideal spy is far from an ideal leader. It's not good if the intelligence service takes over your government, you know what I'm saying? You can tell a lot about a nation's values from the stories that they weave, and Ukraine has a narrative about the rise of the common man into a powerful figure, who then serves the people by not forgetting where he came from. And this is a phenomenon I witnessed personally in Ukraine, as I saw common people showing incredible heroism at a daily basis. Both these TV shows show the image and the values that both leaders are trying to project. Throughout history, people often operate on grand stories, and in the war of Ukraine, we can see this very up close. In this war, both leaders are in effect seeking to embody and be the real-life avatars of idealized character archetypes. You have a man trying to live up to his childhood action hero versus the man trying to live up to the story he wrote for himself. Both are actors in a way, acting out a narrative in their heads, which is what every human being does. What changes is the story we choose to write with our lives. But whether you become a hero or a villain, that is decided by those who have to live with the consequences of your actions. History will not be kind to Putin. Of that I'm certain. As for Zelensky, his story is not over yet. But I'll say this. When he refused to flee Ukraine when the Russians were just outside Kiev, that was impressive. It is the minimum required of a leader, but in our day and age, leaders abandoning their people is typical, and he didn't. But
granted, with all this being said, this video was made a couple of months ago, and just relatively recently, at the time of recording, Zelensky did announce that he wasn't going to be holding elections, which, and sort of like the US, presidents are limited to 2 terms, or as the way it's written from what I've read, 2 terms consecutively. So I don't know if there's some wiggle room there for like having somebody else run between and then trying for a third. I don't know. I barely get into politics as it is, let alone world politics. But yeah, him postponing elections, I mean, yeah, that is kind of, but at the same time, you can kind of see it. They're in the middle of a war, though granted from historically, generally when you're at a war, you don't, very rarely have I ever seen in history a president not being reelected during wartime. At least that's with like US presidents at the very least. But it could also be put in a way of, you know, trying to lessen his own danger, because then he doesn't have to, you know, go out and or him and his people don't have to go out and canvass when, you know, there are literally more important things to worry about at the moment.
But the real heroes are, of course, the Ukrainian people themselves.
Yeah, the ones on the front line.
Their own heroic story in defense of their nation.
And the normal people as well,
through
yeah.
their sacrifice, they're writing an epic narrative greater than any political comedy or spy drama. A narrative is an organized sequence of events with a grand meaning behind it. And the meaning is found in the connection between events. Because if it was a random series of things that just happened with no connection, it wouldn't be a narrative, but a weird kind of probabilistic diarrhea. This means that narratives are the main and sometimes the only way for us to understand reality. It's why philosophers often use allegorical stories to explain their philosophical ideas. What's famous at this point in the war is how Ukraine adopted the Lord of the Rings as a national mythos, using Tolkien's ideas and terminology to describe their fight for survival. As we all know at this point about how Russia is associated with orcs and Sauron. But this isn't just a random popular expression born from online nerd culture. It's been used in official speeches by the Ukrainian Minister of Defense and even Zelensky himself, where Russia is called Mordor, and that Ukraine should not become a frontier of orcs and elves. The Lord of the Rings is an effective narrative because it draws from Western history and the West's understanding of itself, since it's a story about the free folk and men of the West defending themselves against despotic armies from the East. Since in history so many invaders attacked Europe from that direction, the Mongols, Ottomans, etc. A century ago the term Hun was used to describe a violent invader from the East. Now it's orc. What I find strange is that the Russians themselves have a history of identifying with Tolkien's Mordor and orcs. A Russian author even wrote a famous fan fiction called The Last Ring Bearer, where Mordor was the good side while Gandalf and the elves were racist colonizers from the West, which
What? Okay, that is like, granted, I know fan fiction, but at the same time, that just doesn't make sense in the in the world of like Lord of the Rings. Granted, I am not a master when it comes to Lord of the Rings lore, but the orcs, they weren't a natural species. They weren't. They were artificially created by. Was it Sauron? It was one. It was like one of the evil, not gods, but like one of the evil spirits of the world who corrupted like a population of elves, or like made them out of mud. Oh God, it's been so long. Oh, but like from what I remember, orcs are not a natural species. I think, are they made out of mud or something? I'm going to have to look this back up again. It's been so long since I heard this. Oh, I'm sorry.
Provides insight to how the Russians see themselves as a civilization fighting against the West. What If Altus here on YouTube has a good video explaining this. I recommend it. Anyway, for obvious reasons, orc has the controversy of being dehumanizing, and there is that element, yes. But orc is a mythologized illustration of the invader, which left a profound impact on the human psyche. It's a good depiction of what a man can become to another man if he is corrupted by bad choices and historical circumstances. This is because narratives are a way to express the human experience of our ancestors. They organize human factual experience with the emotional experience. Enemy soldier equals orc is emotionally true in that moment, though not factually true. In any case, the use of Lord of the Rings as a metaphor for this war makes sense because it originated from Tolkien's experience in World War I, which was a similar war to this one, with stagnant front lines, trenches, emerging new technologies showing up for the first time in a conventional war, and of course, decadent empires in decline growing to a war and accelerating their own decline. There's a reason why people compare current Russia to the one headed by Tsar Nicholas.
Granted, yeah, it's like long, stagnant front lines that don't move. Yeah, I kind of thought of that before. But emergent technologies appearing on the battlefield in a normal war. I never even thought of that connection. Wow, okay. Wow, okay, that's okay, jeez. Jeez, by that logic, what's World War IV gonna be like if World War III is like this? If this is like the start of World War III, I'm going to think about it.
And the similarities are definitely there. The fact that history tends to repeat itself is actually the main reason why human stories are all the same with similar story beats. From old myths copying each other to the latest Hollywood remake. Older stories are written from historical experience, which becomes relevant when that same experience returns for future generations, inspiring them to write their own stories inspired by similar and universal circumstances of the human condition. This means that our fictional narratives being designed with repeating elements display the grand pattern of our existence, of how the cycle of human existence traverses space and time. The war in Ukraine will then inspire the creation of new stories, which will also be similar to the Lord of the Rings, drawing from similar experience, and the continuous cycle of history ensures the timelessness of these story tropes. The evil empire, the brave defenders, the emperor's henchmen, and especially the hero's journey. The hero's journey, famously discussed by James Campbell, is said to be that reoccurring story that happens in every culture, from classical myths to current superhero films, and basically every book that Tolkien wrote. Most of them anyway. The hero's journey is that story arc of the young protagonist being called to a mission or adventure away from his local home, meeting a mentor, learning the skills to face his trials, going through a climactic challenge, and then earning recognition for his courage after returning home. It's the story of almost every major book or movie, and this is actually the story of the young soldier. The young man being called to a conflict away from his local home, gets training, meets older military officers who work as a mentor, goes through wartime challenges, grows as a person, goes through a very powerful experience that changes him forever, receives recognition for his services, sometimes a medal, then returns home when the war ends. This is the quintessential story of the historical man that played over and over again throughout history in every culture.
Because it happens to every soldier that comes back, at least.
It's why James Campbell called it the monomyth. It's the story of the lucky conscripts or volunteers who managed to survive and weren't completely broken as a result. Of course, reality is a lot harsher and a lot more brutal than any story that we can tell ourselves. But the collective experience of human beings has been mythologized for future generations so that they can understand their duty. Star Wars was based on this concept because George Lucas read James Campbell, so knowing that, perhaps we could understand why that Ukrainian soldier carried the symbol of the Jedi with him to the front. In a way, it actually is his story. And this is true for every narrative trope you can think of. real people embody and become those tropes when history forces them to. And some people do in fact end up resembling the heroes and villains we see in myths, both ancient and modern. While in Ukraine, I met such people. The wise leaders, male and female, guiding those under them through a dark moment. The brave young woman, driven to heal and defend her people and the preservation of her heritage. The relentless survivor who never gives up and goes through a remarkable journey of recovery. The kind and motherly figure always there to care for the most vulnerable, or in my case, a silly foreigner who didn't know the language. The good humor and quick-witted member of the team, driven by a sense of duty, and who knows when to be serious but also when to crack a joke, and enjoys poetry and good music. I spent a lot of time with this one. He had learned English through a gangster rap, which made conversations with him always hilarious and always lighten the mood. These characters we love in our stories exist. They are real people, because they are inspired by real people in times of war, just as Tolkien based Samwise Gamgee on a real person he met in World War I. And the villains are also inspired by real people. The Russian government and the oligarchs are certainly acting a lot like the bad guys do in our great epics. And not just because they're bald. Bad guys are always bald for some reason.
Speaking of which, he was shot down recently. Yay!
And it's also not just the despotic tendency either, as the corrupt tyrant is the most common form of bad guys in our fiction for a reason. But it's the backstabbing, the intrigue, the constant use of fear to keep their own people in line, and the main bad guy killing his underlings and shady assassinations happening behind closed doors. So many Russian oligarchs died in suspicious circumstances, like falling off a window or a private yacht or something, that it's become a running joke. And not a day goes by without Prigozhin struggling for power and accusing Shoigu of treason and Putin being lied to and manipulated by those closest to him.
Again, this part of the video, little dated.
We've seen this exact behavior happening 1,000 times before on the silver screen, and also coincidentally in Russian history. So much so that one of the bad guys mentioned in that NATO tweet, the Harkonnens from the sci-fi novel Dune, were literally inspired by the Russians. That's why the main bad guy in that story is literally called Vladimir. And what's interesting is that Dune was a work of science fiction, trying to imagine the future, and the author Frank Herbert ended up being quite spot on. The politics of the Russian system, filled with oligarchs who have their own private armies headed by an obscenely rich and paranoid emperor in decline, is pretty much exactly how the antagonists operate in Dune, indicating that Frank Herbert was onto something in his analysis of human civilization. And this also demonstrates the power of narratives in predicting the future by analyzing past events. Russia was one of the last nations in Europe to modernize, and now it will be the first to become neo-feudal, as several oligarchs and even bloody Gazprom are creating their own private militaries, just as the lords and corporate guilds had their own militaries in Dune. Also, everything centers around spice mining in that book, and spice is a metaphor for oil. Truly, Herbert was a literary genius. And this predictive power of science fiction shows the power of these grand narratives that keep repeating themselves in our culture, just as history repeats itself. And that's how you can literally predict the future.
И когда у элиты дети мажут себя кремами и показывают это в инстаграмах, там, ютубах и так далее, а у обычных людей дети приходят в цинки, разорванные на куски, то сначала солдаты встанут, а после этого их близкие встанут. Я рекомендую элите Российской Федерации: соберите, сука, своих отроков, отправьте их на войну. И когда вы пойдете на похороны, когда вы их начнете хоронить, то люди скажут: теперь все справедливо.
Now, I know that being cynical is in vogue these days, and people like to paint everything in a morally ambiguous shade of gray. And you can call me cringy, naive, or stupid. But in my time in Ukraine, it really felt like they lived up to the image of the good guys. They were kind, good-natured, always managing to laugh and be in high spirits despite the tragedy. But what surprised me the most was how little hatred I saw for the Russians when compared to other places in conflict and high tension that I have visited, like India and Pakistan and Israel and Palestine. Especially the latter. In that region, the hatred gets so intense you can feel it in the air, and I assumed that every conflict zone was like that, which is why I was so shocked to not see a burning, invisible, obvious hatred for the Russians in Ukraine. I only saw love for their homeland, that famous sentiment of Slava Ukraini. Sometimes they expressed anger, of course, but I can count on one hand the instances where I saw that, and it was done in very human and understandable ways. Like when the missiles hit in the middle of the night, and when I went to work that morning, I met one of my staff members alone looking miserable early in the morning going, "Fucking Russians woke me up and I couldn't go back to sleep." I expressed that same sentiment to my neighbor's dog. I'd be a lot less measured when addressing a invading force. I even asked many of my Ukrainian friends if they hated the Russians, and the answer I got was always no, they didn't hate the Russian people. One of the young ladies at the hospital even told me that they were making an active effort in avoiding hatred because they understood that they had many cultural similarities to the Russians, but they needed to avoid the typical brutality historically common in Russian military doctrine, because it was through moral superiority over Putin and his cronies that they would justify their independence and glorify Ukraine.
Oh God, that is so true. I mean, just you go back and it's, I guess you could call, what is the word? Yeah, you could call Ukrainian culture and Russian culture like brother or sister cultures. Very similar in like many aspects, but they are different. And it's the, the Russian propaganda saying, oh, Ukrainians don't actually exist. They're Russians. They're being tricked into thinking they're not. And a lot of words I could say about that. But the only thing I'm going to say is, even if that was true, you pretend to be different long enough and eventually it will be true.
This, my friends, is one of the most heroic things I've ever heard a human being say. We hear this kind of thinking in stories all the time, from traditionally noble characters, and we take this attitude for granted, but it's entirely different to hear this from someone who lost her home to bombs and occupying soldiers. And this is the beauty of the transcendental archetypes and patterns of human existence within our continuous myth-making about heroes. They're actually about real heroes, real people throughout history in moments like the war in Ukraine, who inspire the existence of these characters, who serve as information that we pass down to future generations. That is why living up to these grand epic narratives are a way for us to try to live forever by merging ourselves with the eternal human story. And it's why the least we can do is admire the Ukrainians. With all this being said, I don't support Ukraine because this war makes for a good story. I support Ukraine because it's the best thing for world peace in the long run. If Putin triumphs and is rewarded for his actions, that might end the war in Ukraine for now, but it'll incentivize other nations into starting their wars. A whole host of leaders have threatened to invade their neighbors recently, from Erdogan to Maduro to Xi Jinping, and the best way to dissuade them is if the world unites itself against such actions. We're indeed in a precarious position. If Ukraine is supported too intensely, things might go nuclear. But if Ukraine is not supported at all, other wars will pop up and destabilize the world, and we might end up going nuclear anyway. If not in Ukraine, then in Korea. Yeah, we're walking a tightrope here, my friends. The world desperately needs one specific scenario to happen, where things don't escalate and don't de-escalate, where we support Ukraine, but also don't threaten Putin so much that he pushes the button. We are really on the edge here, and neutral countries who claim that the invasion is not their problem, and even opportunistically support Russia financially for cheap oil or weapons sales, are missing a golden opportunity for global peace, which they would also benefit from. Brazil and India being a good example, where we have madmen at our own borders threatening to start wars with us, but we can't sympathize with others who suffer that exact same tragedy. In the past, it was only through massive empires enforcing peace through the threat of violence that wars were reduced, the so-called Pax Imperialis. But now, with the end of the Pax Americana and the decline of the American Empire, and with nations gathering in the UN, we had an opportunity to keep the peace through international cooperation and universal condemnation of war. But of course, human flaws will never let that happen because of minimal short-term advantages like cheap gas, so we piss away the opportunity for long-term global peace. Yeah, the Americans were the first to wreck it with the invasion of Iraq, but getting burnt in the Middle East taught them a lesson and they were withdrawing. I also used to consider the dumb argument that if Ukraine was supported too much, That would endanger the whole world with escalation into World War III. So maybe it would have been better to abandon Ukraine and allow Russia to gain its objectives, or force the Ukrainians to settle into a peace that mostly benefited Putin. But with time and reflection, I realized that this is wrong. First off, the Russians have been invading Ukraine before NATO was even a twinkle in Truman's eye. From Tsars to communist comrades to ex-KGB bureaucrats, whoever sits in the seat of Moscow has a series of geopolitical and geographical incentives to invade Ukraine. And the Holodomor, which was one of the worst genocides in history and happened in Ukraine, which they still remember by the way, was not that
I would hope so.
long ago. No, Putin did not invade because NATO was aggressive. Quite the opposite. He invaded because he smelled weakness. Macron was declaring NATO brain dead. NATO countries were threatening war with each other, and the USA suffered an unbelievably humiliating defeat in Afghanistan. This is why Putin went for it, and why he didn't prepare his invasion forces, assuming that his enemies were weaker than they were. Which is why imperialism is inevitable, and we're heading for a time where global powers will fight each other until one comes out victorious and can finally enforce a time of peace after an orgy of death and destruction. And all because human beings are selfish, short-sighted little creatures who prefer short-term zero-sum gains through violence than long-term universal prosperity through peace. Now is the time to talk about real heroes. People who engaged in real good work that saved real lives. The good people at Nodus. Nodus was the hospital I had the honor to work with for a month and a half when I was in Ukraine. It's a clinic and research center that specializes in the rehabilitation and neurological issues of victims, basically helping people walk again. You can imagine that this is the time for their skills. However, due to the nature of their work and the care they give, it's very resource intensive. They need help and donations to keep caring for people and the victims of the war. If you choose to donate, you won't just be helping Ukraine, but the entire world. Maybe even someone you care about in the future, who might benefit from their work, since that's the nature of medical research. Because if there is one silver lining when it comes to war, it's that medical technology advances in these times, so donating to Nodus will help contribute to the medical knowledge and development of all of mankind, as their rehabilitation methods might then be applied to you or someone you love in the future. I remember how they would have meetings discussing their medical research to help the patients and bring further progress to medical science while I goofed off in the corner and watched YouTube videos on my smartphone and waited for my time to shine, which basically meant helping cleaning the equipment and all I could to help out. And if you wish to help them, I'll leave a link down in the description to facilitate that. You can also simply like and share this video, since its proceeds will help fundraise for their cause. It was one of the greatest honors of my life to have met them and spent my time with them, and seen up close what it takes to save lives. I know that donations to Ukraine has received some negative coverage in the press recently as corruption scandals made headlines, but this is actually why donating directly to specific institutions dealing with the direct medical care is so advantageous. Because you know that your money is going directly to said institution, doing hands-on work as opposed to nebulous bureaucracies where your money might get lost in the chaos and fund some random dude's vacation to Paris. By helping to fund a medical clinic in a country in wartime, you know that your donations are not being dropped into the void, but is helping people who need it immediately. Now I'm going to be honest with you guys. Part of me is actually very worried about doing this shout out, because unfortunately, Putin's military has been known to damage hospitals and probably intentionally target them. This is one of the reasons why I've been very worried for their safety in general, as I remember rockets hitting close to our location at least twice in the brief period I was there. But at the same time, they need to be recognized for the work they're doing and the heroes that they are. They know the risks, but they do it anyway. What we can do is ensure that they have the means to continue doing their good work. Thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.
It really does suck when you think about how many times stuff has basically repeated in history like this. How many people have to die for these really stupid and inconsequential things? You know what? If you want to support, I'm literally just gonna copy and paste the link that's in his description into mine. So if you want to support, I have a feeling I will be too in the very near future. But yeah, link to the original video will be in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will be leading to whatever pointless stuff I put out. And yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.